Historically, people looked at theater as really one of the primary sources of entertainment that would have been available to them. You see, before the invention of radio, television, the internet, etc., you really didn't have a lot to do at home, and people didn't stay at home other than really to eat and sleep. The rest of the time you would have gone out, you would have done other things, gone for walks, looked at street performers in the downtown area. Theater would have been a huge part of the entertainment available to you. Now today, television movies have very much replaced radio. But what I want to look at is the history of theater, focusing on the history of theater from the Greeks, or starting with the Greeks and moving to Shakespeare. Now, let's deal with the Greeks. Greek theater, of course, is quite precious to us because it's where theater as we know it is going to be invented. Now, this is not to say that theater did not exist before the Greeks. They did not invent the idea of theater. Rather, what the Greeks do is they formalize, they make it what it is today. They create a convention. Now, before the Greeks, you would have seen theater in the round, something more akin to this, where 1, 2, 3 entertainers would go through, play out a scene, there would be a crowd surrounding them. We also see theater before the Greeks used for ritual, often in a temple or public space. So the Greeks don't invent theater, the concept, but they do invent theater for a mass of people. Because obviously theater in the round, street performance, has some pretty specific limitations in terms of how many people can watch at once. So this means we need to deal with the theater space. And we're starting at the theater of Dionesus. And it's here the history of Western drama begins 2,500 years ago. This kind of open-air theater is called an amphitheater. And this is where some of the most outstanding tragic drama ever written would be first performed. The amphitheater itself was purpose-built. It was part of a sort of professionalization of theater. We would see professional actors, professional writers performing to large audiences of up to 15,000 people. But a performance here 2,500 years ago would have been a very different experience compared to theater today. Once you've got an audience of thousands watching a play, you're dealing with scale, you're dealing with stadium theater, and they have to be able to communicate with the stadium. So the question is, how do they do that? Obviously, there aren't microphones. There aren't big screens. This is one person, one actor on stage. Consequently, they developed two techniques that weren't necessarily new, but something that the Greeks really made their own. One was the use of the chorus. And the idea of a large group of people delivering sometimes text and sometimes song and sometimes poetry, but as a group. And with that mass of people delivering a message, their voices could carry further. You could hear better. The other idea that would be used was masks. A mask allows you to make a face, but the features are larger, so again, you're allowed to amplify. For those people further back, they can see that face, the people in the cheap seats or the nosebleeds. The masks themselves showed a character's gender, age, class, and arguably most importantly, their dominant emotion. Now, obviously, they're not changing masks throughout the play. Oftentimes, you would wear one mask when you're on stage, and then you might change it when you go off stage so that the next time you have a different dominant emotion. But it is always a dominant emotion. It is not trying to cover the full spectrum of what one person could feel. We also see the rise of dialogue. The real breakthrough came when one member of that chorus that we talked about earlier began to talk to another, and suddenly you have dialogue happening on stage. Prior to this, most of what's happening is more of a reading of a story. You could imagine going to Greek theater and hearing a story read to you, more so than acted out. But with dialogue, suddenly you've got something that starts to resemble a play. Over time, 1, then 2, then 3 actors are going to be introduced. The personal interaction between characters becomes the focus of the story, and storytelling turns into drama. Over time, the chorus shrank in size and only commented on the action, or separated scenes with short dances. Performing outdoors in a very large space, the masks, together with colorful costumes and elaborate headdresses, made the actors look larger than life. As there were never more than 3 actors, it also meant that one actor could play a number of different characters. Frequently, that actor would in fact be the playwright. So you're playing multiple roles even within the world of drama itself. Every year, 3 dramatists were chosen to compete in a festival in honor of Dionesus, the god of wine and fertility, exactly the kind of person you want to invite to a party. The idea of the festival of Dionesus was that they were intensely competitive. Of course, everything in the Greek state is a competition. The idea in the introduction of democracy was a competition. So it was absolutely natural that these writers would compete with one another to be crowned the best writer or the best performer. On the final day, there was a classical equivalent of the Oscars, where prizes were awarded for the best tragedy, the best actor, the best production. The test of those writers is they're still with us now. Their stories, their plays have stood the test of time. The plays of 3 tragic writers of genius have survived. The names of this heavyweight trio are Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Their stories are intensely dramatic. A queen murders her warrior husband and is slaughtered in revenge by her own son. A sister is bricked up alive because she refuses to obey the law. A young king unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother and gouges out his eyes when the truth is revealed. All plot lines which have been used in Game of Thrones and TV soap operas. And you can draw those stories back to the Greeks. Those have always been what we've been interested in. We've been interested in seeing what it's like to be a human being, seeing what it's like to be a human being in extreme circumstances. And the Greeks were interested in the fatal flaw of a human, no matter what it is. See, that's the beauty of drama, and the Greeks really focus on it. It allows us to put ourselves in a position that we wouldn't normally find ourselves. For example, you could imagine yourself as a drug-addled doctor who happens to be a remarkable diagnostician, or as a sleuth roaming the streets of London or New York. You can imagine yourself in roles in life that you wouldn't be in otherwise. And that allows us to really explore the human condition, to explore what it means to be human, to experience things outside of our normal. So, quite often, their heroes, although achieving great things, would be brought down by their own flaws. In the Greek world, the perfect tragic hero is one who has a physical defeat and a moral victory, one who is brought down by his ego or some other element of his character. This would be like someone finding redemption only to be killed while saving the life of the president. That would be the perfect Greek tragic hero. That idea of physical defeat and moral victory. We can't just focus on the tragedies, though. Of course, the Greeks didn't purely focus on the tragedies, although they put a lot into them. We also have comedies. At another carnival, comedies would compete for prizes. The actors wore grotesque masks and stuffed bodysuits, which exaggerated their bellies and buttocks. The Greeks by the way, loved lots of jokes about sex and buttocks and everything else. They are, after all, human. The most famous comedic writer is going to be a man by the name of Aristophanes. His plays make fun of classical stories and contemporary events. In Lysistra, one of his most popular plays, the Greeks are forced to change their warring ways when all the women refuse to make love until the men agree to make peace. We can't deal with the classical world and the Greeks without, of course, drawing things a little bit closer to the present. We have to deal with the Romans. For the next 1,000 years, the Western world is dominated by the Romans, and theater, like most Roman art, is going to be copied from the Greeks, and then the Romans will put their own spin on it. But we have inherited a few things from the Romans, such as mime and pantomime, which will originate in Roman theater. Now, what you have to understand, first of all, is in Greek theater, rather than actually performing an action, they would usually talk or speak the action. So instead of picking up a cup, they would say, "I pick up the cup and I drink." The Romans introduced the idea of acting to go with it. So it's not just storytelling, but they also introduced this idea of pantomime, where you would act without words. Well, combine that with the acting of the Greeks, and you get a very powerful, very modern form of theater, something that you would recognize and probably find very entertaining. The Romans also introduced stock character, which is a stereotypical fictional person or type of person in a play. This would be, for example, a specific character with specific traits that are very predictable. The nanny, who is loud and vivacious and childlike, or the emperor, who is gluttonous. The reason they're doing this, the reason why they're using stock characters, is it actually makes life easier. It creates a much larger spectrum of human conditions that can be explored, because we don't have to spend time in the play introducing the nanny. We already know what she's going to be like, so we can just bring her in. We don't have to introduce the emperor if he isn't the center of the story. Again, we can just bring that character in, which means we can focus on other ideas, deeper ideas of what it is to be human. The Romans, of course, being Roman, need to take things one step further, and thus we see the development of fatal theater. The real problem for Roman playwrights was their plays were often presented as part of much bigger entertainment. These massive festivals that usually centered on the blood sport, which are the gladiators. And so the playwrights have to up the ante as well. What we're going to see is the Romans will introduce the idea of fatal theater. In this idea, a character who dies in the play really dies. It'd be like Leonardo DiCaprio actually dying in Romeo and Juliet, so that he can't make Titanic, where he also actually dies, and can't make all the other movies where he actually dies. It would be very different. It would draw people in, but it's a different kind of draw. Now, who do they get to die for these things? Of course, they're using criminals, people who have been convicted, who have been sentenced to death, and they're given the option. On one hand, you can be part of fatal theater. On the other hand, you can be tortured horribly until you die. You can imagine that a lot of people are going to go for the slit throat or the quick stab wound over, being burned alive or whatever else. The bloodthirsty Romans preferred real pain and death to the imaginative debate and shared experience of theater. And it doesn't end there. It's not as simple as plays. Sometimes they will actually recreate battles to do this, with fully armed Roman soldiers versus nude or at least unarmed criminals. I mean, they'll call it the Persians and the Greeks at the Battle of Plataea, but it's exactly the same thing. And they do the same thing with naval combat as well, where again you have fully armed Roman soldiers versus unarmed criminals, and we call it the Battle of Salamis. But of course, remember what the alternative is. It's particularly horrific. The Romans had a lot of really nasty ways of killing people. Let's remember crucifixion. But we can't just talk about how to kill people in an acceptable way in a theater, so let's move on to the end of the classical. Classical theater is characterized by the theater of Dionesus, where the chorus and masks were essential elements. The quintessential characteristics of tragedy and comedy are going to be developed. But the Greeks eventually have to give way to the Romans. When the Roman Empire became Christian in the 4th century, the bloodthirsty public games were closed down, and so were the theaters. And I should point out, fatal theater becomes putting someone to death. You'll notice in the medieval, when you watch people being put to death via various means, there's a lot of theatrical aspects, so it does continue. But theater as a whole is really shut down. It goes dark for hundreds of years in Europe and brings us to the medieval. It was 700 years before formal theater resurfaced, ironically enough, in churches where small scenes were acted out as part of the Easter service. By the 12th century, biblical stories were being performed outside the churches, generally on raised platforms. Gradually, as these plays got longer, the production became more sophisticated. In England, they were produced as cycles, or a series of plays presenting the stories of the Bible from creation to the Last Judgment. Every major town had its own cycle of plays, and these mystery plays, as they're called, would be played out in a 3-day carnival, usually in the spring or early summer. The plays were written by the clergy, but the performance was produced usually by guilds. In other words, there was a guild behind it that paid for it, even though they aren't necessarily performing it. Guilds are societies of merchants and skilled craftsmen. Performers would be amateurs who were chosen from the members of the guild. Now, the guilds are particularly powerful at the time. They maintain a structure that's very similar to a trade union, but controlling both who can produce and the means of production. So they would control who could be an apprentice, who moved up to journeyman, who became a master, who could open a shop, but they also controlled the prices that could be charged. They controlled a lot of things, and in return for this basically monopoly that it gave the tradesperson, the tradesman would pay money to the guild in the form of dues, making the guilds very, very powerful. Now, particular guilds would be responsible for producing a story associated with their profession. For example, the plays became a kind of advertisement. So the Shipbuilders Guild produced the story of the flood, or the Nativity was produced by the shepherds, the Three Kings by the Guild of Goldsmiths. The plays were performed on open-air platforms, either along one side of a square with a mini stage set up for different scenes, or on carts, which would be pulled from one location to another, either in town or between towns. Some of these were traveling performances. The mystery play mixed very serious stories from the Bible with comedic slapstick sketches from contemporary medieval life. The thing is, you can't create this very serious play without having some sort of theatrical palate cleanser, and that's where that slapstick comes in. You can't spend an entire day focusing on tragic, serious subjects. The Greeks knew this, the Romans knew this, and it comes up in the medieval too. The audiences had their favorite characters, like the villainous Satan, and Mac, the cynical sheep stealer. In fact, we still have copies of some of these cycles from the towns of York, Chester, and Coventry in England, and they still get produced today. On the other hand, we also see morality plays. Now, morality plays were basically sermons that were being acted out. So what you're getting at is a more abstract, a more allegorical theme in these plays. For example, encouraging people to live better, to prepare for death, any number of different ideas. The characters were abstract qualities like hope or pride, or personified objects like money. The most famous morality play is called Everyman. And in this play, Everyman meets death and asks for help from those around him. But only good deeds will follow him to the afterlife. Everyman learns to change his ways and finally follows death. All medieval theater really had one thing in common. It explains the world from a Christian viewpoint. These Christian themes focus on a whole series of ideas entirely from that Christian viewpoint or Christian perspective. For example, looking at life on earth as short, tough, and full of temptation. This acts oftentimes as a memento mori, an object serving as a warning or reminder of death. The idea being you need to improve your life now because you don't know what will happen tomorrow. They also look at ideas such as evil deeds will be punished in hell. People who lead a good life will be rewarded with eternal happiness in heaven. The interesting thing in morality plays was it was a return, in some sense, to the idea of plays as part of religious worship, something that we had gotten away from as we moved into the Greek world, and yet we're seeing it as an important element here in the medieval. Telling the Christian story and the audience being able to see something that instructed them was particularly important. And this is why really important elements of a variety of rituals, whether it's a fraternity, whether it's religious, in any number of different ways, frequently takes on a dramatic element because it brings in more senses. You can hear what's being said, you can see the actions taking place, but then you get a sense of touch, you get a sense of smell or of taste, because a good actor can get those ideas across. The more senses you can draw in, the more your audience is going to take in what's going on and really understand it at a deep level and think about it from the Christian perspective. That's perfect. They have these abstract concepts such as being good. Well, that's really difficult to explain, isn't it? How do you explain to someone what being good is? But through drama, through theater, they could show them what it is. They can go through some of the nuances. They can really get across a sense of what they're trying to drive at. So in some sense, this all becomes a form of social control. It's God's plan that drives the story, not character or plot. In medieval times, theater was dominated by mystery plays, guilds of craftsmen, morality plays, and miracle plays. Death and the afterlife were the main focus of Christian medieval drama. It's also the focus of Christianity in the medieval. Remember, there's a lot of uncertainty at the time. Death seems always around the corner. They're trying to prepare people for it. And what better way of doing that than explaining these abstract concepts through drama? But things are about to change. The Renaissance, of course, changes everything. And it does that for theater as well. In 1576, an actor named James Burbidge built the first permanent playhouse in England. Being a very creative person, he called it the theater. Within 25 years, there were 6 more theaters in London, including Shakespeare's Globe. More followed, and for the next 65 years, England experienced a golden age of theater. which produced outstanding playwrights such as Christopher Marlowe, William Shakespeare, and Ben Jonson. In Shakespeare's time, a stage wasn't just one type of space. Plays had to be versatile. The same play might be produced in an outdoor playhouse, an indoor theater, a royal palace, or for a company on tour, maybe the courtyard of an inn. In any of these settings, men and boys played all the characters, male and female. Acting in Renaissance England was exclusively a male profession. Audiences had their favorite performers, looking forward to hearing music with productions and relished the luxurious costumes of the leading characters. The stage itself would be relatively bare. For the most part, playwrights used vivid words instead of scenery to picture the scene on stage. They're following much more the model of the Greeks than they are the model of medieval theater. And where is this taking place? Of course, we have to look at the playhouses, and most famously, the Globe. In 1576, when Shakespeare was still a mere 12-year-old boy in Stratford, James Burbidge built the theater just outside London. And this would be among the first playhouses since Roman times. Like the many other playhouses that followed, it was a multi-story structure, with a central uncovered yard surrounded by 3 tiers of covered seating and a bare raised stage at one end. Now, why leave it as a big open space? Well, the reason is as soon as you enclose the space, you add a great deal of complication. It's basic architecture. If I put a roof over it, suddenly I have to heat it, or I have to cool it. I have to worry about air circulation. I have to worry about a lot of different elements. If I just leave it open, I don't have to worry about those elements. Plus, it makes the entire space cheaper to run. And remember, theaters aren't exactly rolling in money in the 16th century. Spectators could pay for seating at multiple price levels. Those with the cheapest tickets simply stood for the length of the play. Those would be the people in the gallery, on the floor, in the pit. And then you would move up. The richer you were, the higher your seat. Shakespeare's company, known as the Lord Chamberlain's Men because it was being supported by a patron, the Lord Chamberlain at the time, was one of several to perform at the theater, appearing there by about 1594. A few years later, the Burbidges would lose their lease on the theater site and began construction of a new, larger playhouse, the Globe, just south of the Thames. To pay for it, they shared the lease with 5 partners, called actor sharers, in the Lord Chamberlain's company. One of them was Shakespeare. The Globe, which opened in 1599, became the playhouse where audiences first saw some of Shakespeare's best-known plays. Now, in 1613, it burns to the ground when the roof caught fire during a performance of Henry VIII. A new second Globe was quickly built on the site and opened in 1614, merely a year later, and these are very simple structures to build. You don't have all of the elements that we see in modern theater today. We don't have big concession stands and giant banks of bathrooms and everything else. These are much simpler. Large open playhouses like the Globe are marvelous in the right weather, but they do have a slight downside. When it rains, snows, sleets, or anything else, well, it's going to be a very interesting performance. Whereas indoor theaters could operate year-round, out of the sun, wind, and rain. They also offered a more intimate setting with the use of artificial light. Shakespeare's company planned for years to operate its own indoor theater, a goal that was finally achieved in 1609 when the Burbidges took over London's Blackfriars Theatre. Now, let's look at the audience experience. Playgoers in Shakespeare's day paid a penny to stand in the uncovered yard of a playhouse, or 2 pennies for a balcony seat. It's hard to find exact comparisons to what a penny was worth at the time, but a day's worth of food and drink for a grown man would cost about 4 pence. Indoor theaters like the Blackfriar accommodated fewer people and cost more, with basic tickets starting at 6 pence. Fashionable men around town could get a seat on the side of the stage for roughly 24 pence, or 2 shillings. So what did they consume? Well, spectators liked to drink wine or ale and snack on a variety of foods as they watched the plays. Modern-day excavations at playhouses have turned up bottles, spoons, oyster shells, and the remnants of many fruits and nuts. Really, what they're doing is they're bringing in a wide variety of food. Some was probably available there, but they wouldn't have had that massive quantity of concessions and hot dogs and beer and everything else that we see today. A lot of it would have been brought from home, which can be good or bad depending on, well, how the acting's going on stage. It also gives people something to throw at stage, not always the best of ideas. Let's talk about actors' costumes and staging. While most women's roles were played by boys or young men in the all-male cast, comic female parts, such as Juliet's nurse, might be reserved for a popular adult comic actor or clown. In addition to their dramatic talents, actors in Shakespeare's time had to fence on stage with great skill, sing songs or play instruments included in the plays, and perform vigorous athletic dances. Actors usually did not aim for historically accurate costumes, although an occasional toga might appear for a Roman play. Instead, they typically wore gorgeous modern dress, especially for the leading parts. Costumes, of course, are a major investment for an acting company, and they provided the essential spectacle of the plays. They were often second-hand clothes once worn and owned by real-life nobles, often the patron of the theater group or people around that patron. The bare stages of Shakespeare's day had little or no scenery except for objects required by the plot, like a throne, a grave, or a bed. This is throwing back to the ancient Greeks, going way back beyond the medieval theater. They're trying to avoid the use of props and stage settings because they want you to focus on the basic elements of the story. The play as an exploration of the human condition. They believe that anything that detracts from that is going to take away from the play. So you see very minimalist set pieces, but there's also a more pragmatic element here. These groups have very little money. The theatrical groups, even with their patronage, even Shakespeare's group, runs into constant financial difficulty. So you wouldn't want to keep a lot of stage setting items around. These are things that need to be maintained, they need to be purchased, they may need to be changed. It just simplifies things in a day when you might play 4 or 5 different plays in a single day at a single theater. It makes life a lot simpler and a lot cheaper. Exits and entrances were in plain view of the audience, but they included some vertical options. Actors could descend from the heavens above the stage or enter and exit from the hell below via trapdoor. Characters described as talking from above might appear in galleries midway between the stage and the heavens, and the term the heavens refers to, of course, that ceiling that would be painted in this form to look very much like the heavens. So let's talk about some of Shakespeare's genres. And a genre is simply a type of play, tragedy, comedy, history in this case. And let's start with Shakespeare's comedies. Now, comedy is not necessarily what a modern audience would expect comedy to be. While there may be some funny moments, a Shakespearean comedy generally involves some very dramatic plot lines. Usually what defines a Shakespearean play as a comedy is that it has a happy ending, often involving a marriage. The main characteristics of these comedies are a struggle of young lovers to overcome problems, often the result of interference of their elders. There is some element of separation and reunification. Or we see mistaken identities, often involving some element of disguise. We might see a clever servant, or family tensions that are usually resolved in the end. We will see complex interwoven plot lines and the frequent use of puns and other styles of comedy. Ultimately, in drama, a comedy simply refers to a play that's going to have some form of happy ending. And here we see a list of the Shakespearean plays that are generally seen as comedies. Shakespeare, of course, most famously writes his tragedies. And tragedies may involve comedic moments, but tend towards the more serious, dramatic plots, with an ending that involves the death of the main characters. Romeo and Juliet, for example, can appear as if it's a Shakespearean comedy, up to the end when Leonardo DiCaprio bites it. The main features of a Shakespearean tragedy are that characters become isolated, or there is some form of social breakdown. They almost always end in some death. There's a sense that the events that are happening are inevitable or inescapable. And there's usually a central figure who is noble, but with a character flaw which leads them towards their eventual downfall. A lot of this you'll recognize as paralleling the ideas and the themes behind Greek tragedy. That's because Shakespeare's looking back at the Greeks as his most formative element, as his most inspirational element. He's not looking at the medieval theater that we talked about earlier, the morality plays and the mystery works. Finally, there are the histories. Now, Shakespeare's histories focus on English monarchs. They usually play on Elizabethan propaganda. They're basically Tudor propaganda, showing the dangers of civil war, for example, or glorifying the Queen's Tudor ancestors. The depictions of monarchs included Richard III, an enemy of the Tudors, and Henry V, one of the great Tudor monarchs. And these have been influential in creating the perception of these kings, which has persisted throughout the centuries. Many historians point to inaccuracies in the depictions, but the plays have been very powerful in presenting a particular image, which is hard for many people to see past. So when you look at the histories for Shakespeare, you have to understand them not as pure history, because that's not what they are. You have to understand them as propaganda, as history that's being told in a very specific way, so that we can encourage and strengthen the Tudors while weakening any potential enemies and weakening the ideas that the enemies might have. For example, having a civil war, which after the War of the Roses, no one really wants. So let's look at stage and screen after Shakespeare. In 1642, the English playhouses and theaters are closed down, and by the way, often dismantled for building materials, as the English Civil War begins. With the restoration of the English monarchy in 1660, theater returned, as did Shakespeare's plays, now with both male and female performers. The first recorded performance of an actress occurred in December of 1660. Although we're not sure of her name, we know that she appeared as Desdemona in Othello. In the centuries that followed, Shakespeare's plays have been performed in England, North America, and around the world, in productions that mirror the state of theater in each place and each time. From lavish scenes to surrealism to stark, bare stages. They have been used as a medium for political commentary and have been incorporated into theatrical traditions such as Japanese kabuki theater. Beginning in the late 1800s, Shakespeare's plays inspired the creation of a wealth of replica Elizabethan theaters, some more and some less faithful to what was known of the theatrical past, but all trying to draw on that idea of Shakespeare, of the globe, of the Elizabethan theatrical experience, albeit cleaned up for the more contemporary audience. Shakespeare's works have also been frequently interpreted on film. Since then, literally hundreds of Shakespeare's pieces have appeared, including works such as Romeo and Juliet of 1996. And these have appeared, opening a new cinematic stage for Shakespeare's works. Now, as we move forward through the plays and the festivals and everything else going on, what we run into is how to interpret Shakespeare. And the answer is any way you want. I mean, let's look at any one of his plays, maybe Coriolanus. On one hand, there's the more traditional theatrical depiction of Coriolanus with a very bare stage focusing on abstract concepts of betrayal and one's country, one's nation, identity, and these sorts of ideas. On the other hand, we have Richard Feynman, who performed Coriolanus a few years ago on film, and we see very different ideas. Shakespeare is always open to interpretation. Not always by the best actors, but it's always open to interpretation.